Voilà, bienvenue à cette conférence de Mikael Larsson que je vais vous présenter dans un instant. C'est une conférence un peu inhabituelle par rapport à ce que nous faisons au niveau des milieux bibliques, puisqu'aujourd'hui on va s'intéresser plutôt à la réception de la Bible dans le cinéma, vous le verrez. Donc c'est important aussi de se rendre compte de l'impact ou de la reprise de certaines traditions de textes bibliques dans l'art, dans la politique, mais aussi dans le cinéma. Et donc, je suis très heureux que le professeur Larsson de l'Université d'Uppsala a accepté de venir nous donner cette conférence. Le Collège de France et l'Université d'Uppsala, nous avons une convention et nous faisons des échanges de collègues, de professeurs d'une manière assez régulière. Et c'est donc un plaisir d'accueillir le professeur Larsson ici, qui est donc professeur de l'Ancien Testament, de la Bible hébraïque à la faculté Theology de l'Université d'Uppsala, où il a aussi fait sa thèse. Sa thèse, c'était déjà un peu une thèse de réception. C'était sur la violence, Wrestling with Textual Violence, the Jephthah Narrative in Antiquity and Modernity. Donc, c'est sur l'histoire de Jephthé qui doit sacrifier sa propre fille dans l'histoire du livre des Juges. Et Mikael Larsson s'est intéressé à la réception de ce texte assez compliqué. Donc, il est également président élu de la Société exégétique suédoise, donc il est en fait le président de tous les biblistes suédois, et nous sommes très heureux qu'il a pu quand même venir ici. Et je lui donne la parole. Donc, M. Larsson s'exprimera en anglais. Vous avez les PowerPoint. Après les questions, on peut aussi les poser en français, il n'y a pas de problème. Donc, je lui donne la parole et je le remercie de sa venue.
Bon, merci beaucoup au Collège de France et à professeur Thomas Römer pour l'invitation et pour l'accueil. Je suis tellement ravi d'être là. But I will continue in English. Danish director Lars von Trier is a divisive figure in world cinema. Since his breakthrough 4 decades ago, he has been called enfant terrible, punk auteur, virtuoso renewer of film, just to mention a few labels. I see 3 contributing factors to his fame/infamy. First, his films consistently trigger intense affective responses in critics and audiences alike. In Cannes, his most recent film, The House that Jack Built, was met by walkouts and vomiting. Another element to his contested status is the combination of theological motifs, such as sacrifice, with persistent form experiments, with preferably despised genres like reality TV. Finally, the director sparks attention through the enmeshment of oeuvre and life. For example, by claiming in interviews to identify with the serial killer Jack in The House. Today, I offer some glimpses of von Trier's usage of biblical traditions in 3 of his later films, Antichrist, Nymphomaniac, and The House that Jack Built. In short, my main questions are, how does the Bible appear, and to what ends? By way of introduction, I briefly situate the films in von Trier's oeuvre and the Nordic context, and say a few words about the frame of these studies. I then introduce each film and give examples of biblical usage. In conclusion, I summarize the effects of biblical reception and suggest what new questions the films may raise in order to finally land in the question of the title. Is von Trier's Bible a blasphemous one? Von Trier works often in trilogies. His public breakthrough, Breaking the Waves, from 1996 opens the so-called Golden Heart trilogy. Inspired by a Danish folk story, these films feature heroines with gold hearts who negotiate goodness through sacrifice and suffering. And the films are known for their emblematic use of shaky hand cameras and the quest for truth, in line with the Dogma Manifest. Dogville and Manderley attest to yet another artistic term to film theater. And these films feature female liberator figures who end up as avengers or puppet masters over people who shuns their freedom. And then this brings us to the Depression trilogy, where Antichrist takes us back to Eden, Melancholia brings us to the apocalypse, and Nymphomaniac projects sexuality's heaven and hell. The casting of the theme of women's struggle in a man's world enhanced the interconnectedness of the films, with Charlotte Gainsbourg starring in all three, for example. Von Trier began such exploration with the image of raging motherhood in Medea already in 1988. He continued with idealist femininity in the Goldheart trilogy and progressed to the complex savior figures or anti-savior figures in Dogville and Manderley. Von Trier's last feature film, The House That Jack Built, might appear like a change of direction. The women in the house are hyperbolic caricatures rather than complex characters, whereas the male protagonist is likewise idealist as his counterparts in Antichrist, Melancholia, or the early Europa trilogy, if less obviously weak. Yet the thematic correspondences include the war between the sexes and the tension between freedom and guilt. Von Trier's oeuvre relates in different ways to the Nordic context. Decades of engagement with biblical films appear to put him at odds with Nordic self-perception as the most secularized region in the world, while at the same time aligning him with 500 years of Lutheran state churches. His films accords with the tradition of Nordic filmmakers taking issue with this Lutheran heritage. The Dane Carl Theodor Dreyer staged, for example, the woman as warrior saint in The Passion of Joan of Arc, already in 1928. And the Swede Ingmar Bergman featured suffering women in his God trilogy in the 50s or early 60s. Von Trier's films recurrently sparks controversies around gender politics. In a Nordic context of alleged state feminism, manifesting, for example, in generous regulations for parental leave, social democrat proclamations of a feminist foreign policy, or a majority of women as prime ministers in the Nordic countries as of June 2021. This is particularly sensitive, I would say. And gender critics debate whether von Trier's persistent thematizing of women's suffering under patriarchy is a good or bad thing, an issue to which I will return. The current studies are an example of reception criticism, informed by a feminist perspective in the particular field of Bible and film. One can do reception studies in different ways. Some understand the assignment as historical, tracing the itineraries of the text through the centuries. Others see the point of reception studies as shedding light on the biblical text, using later receptions as a kind of commentary, unlocking new facets of meaning. Still others aim to examine critically the implications of different uses or abuses of biblical traditions. Whose interest do the various mobilizations of the Bible in the public square serve or obstruct? Feminist scholars belong to the latter category. reception criticism. They have contributed to advancing reception studies by introducing new types of material, for example, literature or political speeches, as well as going beyond description to critique. In the current investigation, the feminist lens offers focus. I'm not interested in simply mapping any biblical usage, but in particular, how this usage shapes sexual politics. In the maturing field of Bible and film, many stress the importance of considering film on its own terms, taking into account not only the script, but also sound and film editing, for example. A recent development of the film is to not just explore the Bible on film, that is paraphrase, or the Bible in film, deployment of biblical elements, but also to venture in the opposite direction, film as Bible, to consider how film can mimic biblical practices or genres, such as lament or apocalypse. And another contribution in this field is to also be attentive of the new questions that the film poses to biblical traditions, so to speak, in return. A common denominator for feminist scholars as well as Bible and film scholars lies in the mobilization of critical theory to think with. I refrain here from elaborating on the role of theory in these studies, with one exception. Film scholar Jan Simons has described von Trier as working like a DJ, through pastiche and eclectic quotation, thereby creating his own virtual history of, for example, post-slavery America in Mandalay. I claim that the same goes for the director's use of biblical traditions, resulting in von Trier's own virtual Bible. One could make a similar case for philosophy or psychoanalysis, but that's another lecture. What we're interested in today is which Bible appears in these films and why. Which brings us to the first movie, Antichrist. A brief synopsis of the narrative runs as follows. A couple loses their child and the woman falls ill with grief. The man is a therapist and decides to take her out of the hospital and treat her himself through exposure. They go to their cabin in the woods, the place that the woman fears the most. The treatment degenerates and the film portrays the couple's descent to the realm of death. In the end, the man kills the woman and burns the cabin. As he limps out of Eden, he encounters a myriad of women. Antichrist is a pastiche of the horror movie, while also containing elements from the children's saga with speaking foxes, video art, dreamlike stills, pornography, graphic penetration, or the splatter movie with genital mutilation. The film divides into 4 main chapters, named after the folkloristic motif of the 3 beggars. These appear in the film as children's toys, constellation of storms, and messengers in animal form. The deer, the fox, the crow, all signaling imminent death. The prologue and the epilogue serves as frame, filmed in black and white, with light and serene images, in stark contrast to the darkness and violence in between. This frame contains no dialogue, but airs Friedrich Handel's soprano aria Lascia Ch'io pianga from Rinaldo, set in Jerusalem during the Crusades. The lament of a woman held captive in a palace garden frames the film's tale of a mourning and points to the first major biblical intertext, the creation narrative. The film's numerous allusions to the creation account are both explicit and implicit and concern names, motifs, themes, and structures. I will offer a few examples. In Antichrist, Eden is the name of the couple's remote cabin. Formerly the woman's favorite place, the Garden of Eden, that is, the nature around the cottage, now evokes fear and anguish. Far from the harmonious haven of the first creation account, it has become a space where nature threatens from outside as well as from within. Staging the man and the woman as generic and anonymous representatives of humanity is another echo of the biblical text. The film first endows the couple with a limited set of stereotypical traits: the man with rationality, self-control, and scientific mindset, the woman with superstition, hysteria, and nature. The couple's only son, Nick, dies already in the prologue, presenting the child's death as a fall in slow motion while his parents are having sex, corresponds visually to the popular Christian understanding of Genesis 3 as a fall, connecting sexuality with death. A number of elements from Genesis Eden appear in inverted form in Antichrist. First, an ominous tree appears for the woman during hypnosis and then repeatedly in dreamlike stills. It is an unnatural tree, larger than the others, to which the woman professes a certain connection. Most remarkably, it's a dead tree, with no greenery and no fruit, an anti-tree in relation to the tree of life or the tree of knowledge. Secondly, the wind undergoes a sinister makeover in the film. In Genesis 1, the hovering of God's wind or spirit testifies to the deity's sovereignty over foreign deities. And in Genesis 3, the deity's stroll in the garden in the evening wind precedes the holding of the humans accountable. In Antichrist, however, the woman understands the gentle breeze as the breath of Satan. Although the man rebukes her, he starts to fear the wind himself, and which repeatedly leads him to signs of death. A final example of inversion has to do with the overall structure. Whereas the movement in the first creation account goes from chaos to cosmos, Antichrist stages the opposite movement. From city to forest, from dressed and well-behaved to nude and violent. Knowledge is a central theme in the second creation account, as well as in the film. To the frustration of many readers, the biblical text does not specify what kind of knowledge the tree holds. Without going into details, the film pits the woman's intuitive and potentially dangerous knowledge against the man's allegedly scientific methods. Part of the woman's grief is about self-accusation. Didn't she know that their son had learned to open the baby gate? The man's choice to take the woman out of the hospital demonstrates both disbelief in the offered treatment and confidence in his own capabilities. The man thereby transgresses a first prohibition, never treat your own family, soon followed by a second one, never have sex with a patient. Things start to deteriorate when the man hides knowledge from the woman in the form of an autopsy report and goes into hiding himself. In the following lethal game of hide and seek, the woman utters Yahweh's line from 3:9, "Where are you?" in seeking like Yahweh to hold the man accountable. The man punishes the man when she finds him, crushing his groins and penetrating his leg, but she doesn't kill him. Instead, in what became the most controversial scene of the film, she turns the weapons of patriarchy against herself and cuts off her clitoris with rusty scissors. In terms of biblical usage, one can understand the violence perpetrated against herself as well as the man as an attempt to negate the eschatological statement in Genesis 3:16 that the woman shall desire her husband and that he shall rule over her. Antichrist samplings from the New Testaments are fewer and less direct than the ones from the creation, and I will not take the time to go through these. A core issue, however, has to do with the manner in which both the man and the woman oscillates between identifying as either Christ or Antichrist figures. The man's Christ features are visual, like outstretched hand nailed to wood, and related to casting, with Wilhelm Defoe and his previous appearances in The Last Temptation of Christ. The main antichrist feature of the man is obviously that he kills the woman rather than saves her. For the woman, the violence she perpetrates against the man. And for the woman, yes. Yet, the staging of the woman's anguish draws from the synoptic's account of Gethsemane, the dripping of the blood, the falling asleep of the friends, the denied request for consolation. The crucifixion through the theme of abandonment or willing surrender to death, and possibly also from the resurrection. In a typically von Trier's twist, a myriad of faceless and voiceless women meet the man on his way out of Eden. Does the replacement of the woman by an anonymous collective amount to a transcending of the conflict between the man and the woman? I will leave that as a cliffhanger. Let's now take the leap from horror to pornography with Nymphomaniac. The plot is apparently simple. In Volume 1, the young Jo tells the story of her life up to the point when she loses all sexual sensation, the film's main complication. In Volume 2, the mature Jo recounts her quest to regain pleasure. Despite reaching this goal in a sadomasochist session, desire remains unsatisfied. Moving into a world of crime, she kills the man who betrays her. The succession of events mirrors a regressive movement from privileged existence to the gutter. At the level of narration, Nymphomaniac stages a context between rivaling interpretations of Jo's life. This begins at the chronological end, with Jo lying in the street and the enigmatic Seligman offering her shelter. The ensuing conversation constitutes the frame of the film. Organized in 8 chapters, the narrative level suggests a movement towards increased agency, where Jo proceeds from the gutter to the safe space. Nymphomaniac relates to pornography in complex ways. The film significantly thematizes lost desire rather than satisfaction, and strongly emphasizes the spoken word. Religious traditions appear in the film through artworks, music, theological concepts, biblical text, and ritual. Of this material, I offer 3 examples of biblical usage: the Bible as artifact, the practices of transmitting a tradition, and 1 intertext from the Gospels. In the first chapter of the film, a handbook in fly fishing features both as a religious artifact and as a model for interpretation. In a flashback to his childhood, Seligman reminisces that he had a book he worshipped like a romantic nature Bible. Whereas the designation Bible may simply indicate expert manual, the complete Angler features both as a religious artifact through its old age, its appearance, leather-bound, the reverence with which he handles it physically, the particularity of the memory, shot in black and white, and its excess of meaning. In the dialogue with Jo, the book provides a model for understanding a particular sexual experience. A competition between Jo and her friend B about who can sleep with the most men during a train ride. In the account of this memory, fly fishing develops into an elaborate allegory. Jo identifies as a fly, that is as a nymph, when she dresses up in fuck me clothes. Walking through the train becomes a way of reading the river, understanding its topography, and localizing the biggest fish. When men are easy to pick up, it becomes a feeding frenzy, etc. 2 observations are particularly important: the apparently constructed character of the scene and its focus on the game aspect. Sexual practice emerges here as mechanics, devoid of romance or ecstasy. To make a long story short, I conclude that the image of the young nymphomaniac undergoes a more radical modification than the notion of scripture in this first chapter. The young woman's attitude of cold calculation breaks with the cliché of the insatiable nymphomaniac driven by her passions. Through their sexual practice, they negotiate agency. Identifying the complete angler as a Bible may appear as a novelty in terms of its application to sexuality. That the book serves as a tool for disenchantment rather than sacralization still accords with its status as canon, with the capacity to unveil the proper nature of existence, that is, sexuality. The second major type of biblical usage has to do with practice, transference of tradition and contemplative reading. The formative experience is when Joe's father recounts the Nordic sagas about the creation of the trees. These moments of intimacy take place during walks in the forest, and it is part of the ritual that Joe asks him to recount it every time, like the son in the Hebrew Bible asking about Pesach, for example. Flashbacks to her father's storytelling occur during specific crises in Joe's adult life, and I will limit myself to just mentioning one. In chapter 3, she picks up her father's herbarium called My Little Book of Comfort and watches the leaves in order to counterweigh the stress of managing her many lovers. Throughout the film, these practices undergoes a number of phases. Joe's first-hand experience of oral storytelling in the context of a ritual practice transforms into an instrumental transfer of information through a written text, a failed one to her protege in the context of consumerism. Thematically, the child's awe before the origin of creation evolves into the mature woman's awe before loneliness and death. The third type of biblical usage appears through intertext in the 6th chapter, the Eastern and Western Church. Seligman here contrasts the Eastern Church, its joy and mystery, with the Western Church, obsessed with suffering and guilt. Joe interprets her journey from ecstasy to pain as a movement from east to west, from transfiguration to passion. I focus on the former here, which is subject to visual paraphrase. The passion narrative mainly appears through allusions to Gethsemane and the flagellation in similar ways as we saw with the creation narrative in Antichrist. The transfiguration of Jesus constitutes a prism for Joe's account of her first orgasm. The film sets the event during a school trip to the mountains, where Joe lies down on a meadow and levitates to assume a central position between two women. 3 girl classmates are nearby, and a shot of the glaring sun precedes the event, but with no joint ascent or descent, no conversation, and no authoritative voice expressing approval. The film replaces Moses and Elijah with the Roman Empress Valeria Messalina and the whore of Babylon from Revelation. Joe claims not to know these figures, who Seligman identifies through attributes like Messalina's veil and her holding of a baby. Presenting the miracle of Joe's levitation through blatantly dated special effects enhances the uncertainty about what really happened, that the event could be an illusion even in the fictional world. The function of Messalina and the prostitute resembles that of Moses and Elijah in revealing the main character's identity and in providing it with mythological or pseudo-mythological legitimacy. Messalina is presented as the most notorious nymphomaniac in history, and the prostitute figure builds on the image of Israel as an adulterous spouse from prophetic tradition. These figures foreshadow Jo's development from denial to reclaiming of her identity as nymphomaniac. To conclude, I see several possible effects of scriptural usage. A first is to complicate the figure of the nymphomaniac. Staged as transfiguration, pleasure appears as ambiguous and as implying sacrifice. A second effect is to intensify and widen the scope of Jo's experience. Presenting sexuality as a miracle, Jo transcends the ordinary. This scriptural usage transforms a solitary event into a collective one through the presence of prophets, that is Messalina in Babylon, and disciples, the schoolmates. Finally, one could also see Jo's transfiguration as a form of parody, exposing the original to be as much of a fantasy as the copy. To complicate things even further, the film invokes yet another intertext, Richard Wagner's Das Rheingold. The descent from the Mount of Transfiguration is set to the fall into Niflheim, and illustrated by Jo's and Seligman's bodies spiraling towards a sea of books. I consider this juxtaposition as a case of mythological double exposure, inviting the viewer to understand Jo's fate as extending beyond individual tragedy. Pleasure or no pleasure becomes a matter of life and death. Our last stop in this tour of genres is at von Trier's adaptation of the serial killer movie. The protagonist Jack gives an account of his life of murdering to a character named Verge while descending into hell. The film is structured in 5 chapters called Incidents and an epilogue, where each incident conveys a paradigmatic killing. The film shifts between 2 levels of narration, the mimetic showing of Jack's crimes and the discursive quarrel over their interpretation. The real drama resides within the latter. Will Jack be able to convince Verge that the killings are indeed works of art? Jack meets Verge after the last incident in Jack's walk-in freezer, where the 2 levels of narration intersect. Encouraged by Verge, Jack builds a house of corpses, which magically becomes an escape route from the police, as well as an entry point to hell. Descending further through its circles, Jack falls into his death when he vainly seeks a way out. Whereas biblical reception in the house is as multifaceted as in the previous films, it appears more implicit and mediated in several layers of culture. Most obviously Dante's Divine Comedy. And I will offer 2 brief examples before turning to the practice of confession. In the Hebrew Bible, names function as a way of defining characters, most evidently with Adam for man and Eve for life, but also with complex figures like Jacob, meaning heel or the verb to deceive. The house displays a similar logic with the names of the main characters. A medieval diminutive of John, possibly influenced by Jacques, Jack served as a reference to any man, in line with the English nursery rhyme that the film's title recalls. The modern expression, Jack of all trades, master of none, fits the protagonist as someone who is crafty but excels at nothing, except killing, possibly. Verge, an abbreviation from the Latin name Virgilius, in Middle French apparently meant rod or wand, and in medieval English and urban slang denotes penis or incomplete virgin, whatever that is. The ambiguity of the term corresponds to the director's characteristic mixing of the fine arts and popular culture. That is, Dante and the Bible with children's rhymes and slang. Jack invokes biblical tradition by analogy, presenting a collective mankind as an individual Adam. Together, the names stage generic man in dialogue with a representative of divine phallic power. The setting of the film, Hell, connects to apocalyptic motifs and the concept of final judgment. Images of lava and drowning people, the buzzing sound from the cries of the damned souls, and the bad taste of sulfur in Jack's mouth all belong to stock conventions of doomed afterlife, exemplified further in the visual paraphrase of Delacroix's painting The Bark of Dante. The name of the epilogue, Katabasis, invokes the frequent mythological theme of the hero who travels to the netherworld to retrieve a loved one or gain access to new knowledge. One can read the Gospel of John through the reciprocal movements of katabasis, the word descending to earth, and anabasis, the word returning to God. In Robert Bly's Iron John, katabasis represents the young man's experience of humiliation and shame before reaching mature manhood. As you can see, von Trier's virtual hell is an amalgam of classics and pop culture. The house introduces the notion of confession in its very first dialogue. Verge replies to Jack's seemingly casual question, "Can I ask you something?" with a general observation that people are overcome with the need to confess along these tracks. As noted before, the context connotes judgment and the frame points to the practice of confession. In biblical tradition, to make a long story short, confession connotes an expression of faith as well as an recognition of sins. In the Hebrew Bible, both aspects restore the relationship between God and humans. In the New Testament, confession of faith marks identity and boundaries, whereas confession of sins relate to eschatological judgment, conversion, healing, or forgiveness. Jack's tale cannot qualify as a confession of sin since it is devoid of contrition and does not lead to penance. It does function as a confession of faith, however, in the sense of a declaration of beliefs in the face of impending death. Combining idealist romanticism and Nietzschean critique of Christianity, Jack's credo lies in embracing the tiger and in refusing to be a slave. In line with such reasoning, Jack identifies mass murderers as icon builders and understands God as the great architect, which for Jack means controlling the university and standing above morality. Jack's aspiration to identify with the divine as artist appears mockingly in his many failed attempts to build a physical house, morbidly in his so-called House of Corpses, but most clearly through the two aspects of confession: confession as spectacle and confession as contest and complicity. At the mimetic level, Jack's murders manifest hyperbolic violence. The conscientiousness with which he photographs his victims, sends pictures to the local press, and thus creates a persona, points in the same direction. Today, we would say that he stages the killings to be Instagram-worthy. At the level of narration, aesthetics lies at the heart of Jack's and Verge's interaction. The first dialogue centers on the rules of narration and artistic quality of speech. Jack's discourse here becomes a means for transformation, if not by eradicating guilt, as in Confession of Sin. Rather, Jack seeks to exalt ignoble crimes to great works of art. Fitting a story of violent acts into a grander narrative of male heroism, Jack inserts himself in collectives of male tyrants and artists as figures of identification or competition. Jack's confession of faith serves as a plea for acceptance and redemption from a life of insignificance. This brings us to the final aspect of confession, contest and complicity, which relate to the fact that confession unfolds within a relationship of power. Verge emerges as a rather unwilling and ambivalent confessor, alternating between resistance and interest. Jack, in turn, oscillates between seeking approval from Verge and accusing him of mediocrity and hypocrisy. When conflict bursts out, name-calling and accusations create proximity rather than distance. Discourse becomes a space for subject formation. Verge feeds on the challenge to bolster his authority, whereas Jack, complicit and subordinate, thrives in the closeness of power. Yes. Sorry. Now for some conclusions. A common denominator in these studies has been to explore how and why biblical receptions shape particular manifestation of sexual politics. So what does the use of biblical traditions achieve in this regard? With Antichrist, my specific question had to do with the possibility of establishing a winner in the lethal war between the sexes. Did biblical reception point in a certain direction? The short answer is no. The man and the woman both have mixed payoffs. Whereas the allusions to Genesis underline the general character of the conflict, those related to the Gospels enhance complexity, in particular for the woman. A possible outcome of the film is to expose the consequence of a certain set of game dynamics, or if you will, power structures. The force of the film lies in the tension between its own virtual world and the real world outside the cinemas. Moving on to Nymphomaniac, the aim was to investigate the interplay between biblical traditions and conceptions of gender and sexuality. The particular problem concerned the impact of the altered repetitions of traditions and gender that the film proposes. A general conclusion was that the sexual stereotypes undergo more change than religious traditions. I identify three modifications of the nymphomaniac and the masochist. The first, to present them as rational and hard-working figures, rather than as uncontrollably governed by their libido. Second, that they feature as the average Joe rather than as the exception. And thirdly, that they exemplify ideal discipleship rather than pathology. With regard to biblical traditions, the film adapts these to a contemporary setting, but generally retains their key functions. In sum, Nymphomaniac demonstrates fidelity both to detail and to the overarching tendencies of these texts and practices, in a way that one could perceive as conventional in relation to religious tradition, or as countercultural in relation to secular Nordic societies. With The House, finally, the purpose was to explore the significance of biblical traditions in the film's conceptualization of masculinity and to discuss its broader gender political implication. In this case, assessing the effects of the film's usage of biblical traditions, that is, whether Jack's confession is successful or not, seems particularly tricky. On the one hand, Jack dies without recognizing any fault, his character undergoes no development, he offers no penance and receives no absolution. Falling into the abyss could indicate that he fails as a confessant of sins. On the other hand, one could also see his death as the climactic ending of a confession of faith, staged as the ultimate drama, placing him in the company of martyrs and bolstering his claims to hegemony. In contrast to Antichrist and Nymphomaniac, the use of biblical traditions in The House adds no complication to Jack's character. In parallel to Nymphomaniac, biblical reception in The House raises the issue of belonging. For Jack, however, this also becomes a matter of faith, although of a Nietzschean kind. In retrospect, then, what new questions do these films pose to biblical traditions? With Antichrist, I argue that the film complicates the idea of creation as a unilateral movement from chaos to cosmos. It also stands as a protest against the judgment on the woman to desire and submit, and its devastating effects in reception history. In relation to transfiguration and passion narratives, the film enhances the connection between bliss and suffering that already exists in the Gospels. It also raises pertinent issues about popular perceptions of the Jesus figure, adding complexity in the form of wrath and aggression to his alleged meekness, silence, or willing obedience. Returning to Nymphomaniac 6 years after my first study, it strikes me that the film potentially does not leave religious tradition quite as intact as I then thought. If the film builds on the biblical connection between transgression and passion, one could perhaps imagine that the flow goes in the other direction as well. To put it bluntly, is the suffering servant also the blissful servant? The fictional Jack shares traits with the all too real Norwegian terrorist Anders Behring Breivik. To both, religious traditions offer material for rationalizing violence and for cultural belonging. In 2020, when I started that piece, the incel movement was a marginal phenomenon, at least in Sweden. Last year, Andrew Tate, the self-proclaimed king of toxic masculinity, was the third most Googled person in the world, with 10 million followers on X. The house, in my view, efficiently points to the relation between past and present, extreme and mundane, human and divine masculinities. The film problematizes the practice of confession in contemporary society and shows how it can serve as an arena for shoring up destructive configurations of masculinity. So, is the Bible that emerges from von Trier's later films blasphemous or not? That depends on a number of things. In terms of the selection of biblical intertext, the films remain securely within the confines of Christian interpretive tradition as well as film history, in working with creation, transfiguration, passion, and a bit of apocalypse. Furthermore, at the level of the text or film, which is my focus, fidelity rather than upheaval marks the adaptation of biblical material. The films recontextualize the material, exchanges its actors, sometimes inverts certain elements, but does not radically alter its function. Recurrent biblical practices like confession, allegory, transmission of tradition or contemplative reading connect to Jewish, Protestant or Catholic traditions. One distinct aspect of biblical usage is how the films relate its actors to tradition through identification, making them intelligible by inserting them into a greater narrative. I perceive that as a Lutheran pietist move, but one could also see Jack and Joe as representatives of culture Protestantism, to speak with Karl Barth. The films challenge viewers to consider why, if at all, it is easier to stomach Joe's ideal discipleship than Jack's. The controversies arising from each film offer no clear verdict on whether the migration from pathology to religion is a successful or disrespectful one. Centering more on the reification or exposure of misogyny rather than the specifics of scriptural interpretation, the charge of blasphemy seems more acute in relation to the issue of equal rights and secular sensibilities. The outrage in a Nordic context is rather to suggest that inequality remains and that one can mobilize religion meaningfully to understand sexuality. A key factor here and a contested issue among feminist scholars is how to assess exposure. That is, whether the virtual can destabilize the real and thereby contribute to change. I have argued elsewhere that blaming the director for upholding patriarchy is analogous to killing the messenger. I do believe that these films effectively unveils mechanisms of power that we hoped we had left behind a long time ago. Last week at the yearly conference of the Swedish Exegetical Society, Professor Katrine Williams gave a talk on Paul's multifaceted use of citations from the Hebrew Bible. She argued that the communicative force lies not so much in his audience knowing how to distinguish the exact nuances in every alteration of the Septuagint, but in recognizing more vaguely the overall picture, sensing the continuity with tradition and thereby its validity. I believe something similar is at play here. No matter how secular the Scandinavians or Europeans perceive themselves, the biblical material still resonates, however vaguely, and contributes to the effective force of these films. Thank you.